Welcome from the League of Women Voters of Portland. I'm Carolyn Bubert, President. Tonight's program is titled Transportation Challenges, Portland and Beyond. This is particularly timely as the budget development process is getting underway for the City of Portland. The Portland Bureau of Transportation, or PBOT, faces significant revenue and cost challenges. But PBOT is not alone among transportation agencies. PBOT operates within a regional system. We'll help you sort out the interconnections among the various governmental agencies. The League is dedicated to making democracy work, and one of our core values is that democracy functions best when voters are informed and engaged. We present programs like this to give our Portland neighbors an opportunity to learn and think about issues that affect them and their lives. After tonight, please tell your friends, colleagues, and family to watch this video or listen to the podcast of this program. Links to those recordings will be posted on our website. It's lwvpdx.org after November 17th. Our moderator tonight is Chris Smith. He's a transportation policy expert and also a longtime community volunteer. Chris will provide the context for our program and introduce our panelists. Chris, I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Transportation is a topic that touches all of our lives and all of our communities. It's how we access opportunities, whether in the form of jobs, education, recreation, shopping, or simply getting together with friends and family. This is especially true for people with jobs or responsibilities that cannot be handled via Zoom. Transportation is inseparably intertwined with other aspects of our lives. One example is housing, as people trade off longer travel distances and greater transportation costs while seeking more affordable housing. Another example is the intrinsic connection between transportation and health. Individual health is influenced by the particulates and emissions in the air that we breathe. The health of our community is affected by transportation networks that determine how we access healthy food and medical services. Crashes are killing a sadly increasing number of our community members every year. The health of our planet is also in jeopardy as transportation is one of the largest sources of greenhouse gases. And these health impacts land harder on communities of color and our low-income neighbors. Addressing these impacts faces many challenges. Governance is a complicating dynamic. A transportation project may be planned, built, and funded by some combination of as many as 5 levels of government. Tonight, we begin our conversation on transportation situation in Portland, but as I suspect Director Williams will tell you, the Portland Bureau of Transportation, PBOT, can't be successful without partnerships with Metro, TriMet, Multnomah County, the state of Oregon, and the occasional grant funding from the federal government. A simple shopping trip in Portland could easily pass over facilities owned by 3 of these entities. And of course, those facilities need to be built and maintained, which costs money. We have traditionally viewed transportation funding as being based on user fees, largely in the form of a tax on fuels or fees on vehicles, but increasingly we're seeing technology and inflation erode the buying power of those sources. At the federal and state level, we're seeing increased use of general fund transfers to keep the system operating. For example, $1 billion of general fund bonding committed to the interstate bridge replacement. The same erosion has been challenging PBOT budgets for many years. In addition, we have not seen much appetite locally for diverting general funds. The net result is that PBOT's budget now appears to be in crisis. Unfortunately, our limited time this evening means that we can't cover every transportation topic, including some of my favorites like public transit, biking, and the movement of goods, freight. Nevertheless, we have a great panel ready to educate us about other critical transportation topics. With that background, let's turn to our panelists. For each of their presentations, I'll do a brief introduction that they can add to as necessary. After we hear from each panelist, there will be a Q&A session, and you can put your questions in the chat. We'll get to as many as possible. One late-breaking change on our panel is that Metro Councilor Ashton Simpson had an unavoidable change in his schedule. As a longtime volunteer on these issues, I have a good handle on the role of Metro in transportation planning, and will pitch hit for Councilor Simpson, who sends his regrets. We begin with the director of the Portland Bureau of Transportation, Millicent Williams. She is a career public servant, including appointment to several senior level positions under 3 mayors in Washington, D.C. Millicent managed PBOT's Capital Delivery Division from 2017 to 2020 and was deputy director until May 2021. She then did a stint in the private sector, but returned to PBOT when appointed its director last summer. Millicent.
Good evening, and thank you, Chris. I'm really excited about being a part of this conversation. And I'm going to be sharing my screen to be able to share some information and data about where we are as an organization and how we're going to be able to hopefully weather what we consider a considerable storm in the near future and talk about our plans for the longer term future. So as has been stated, I am the director of the Portland Bureau of Transportation. And as I've also shared, I am honored to be joining you here tonight. Thank you to the League of Women Voters for facilitating this important discussion and to my fellow panelists for their time. This is a critical moment for transportation in Portland, in the state, and in the country. And we must work together to find solutions for the next century of mobility and growth. I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides that I'll walk through. I recognize that time is limited, and I want to make sure that I balance my time with the time that's been dedicated to other panelists as well. Transportation and transportation-related infrastructure is so present that it's practically invisible. I said it just today to some of our team members who are out replacing street signs. From the moment that you walk out of your door, you're interacting with our transportation system. Every street, sidewalk, bike lane, bridge, signalized intersection, and street light represent much of what PBOT is and what PBOT does. As you can see from this image, PBOT manages and maintains over $19 billion in assets that are critical in keeping our city moving. And the work goes beyond just managing our assets. PBOT programs like the ones shown here are crucial for building community, improving mobility, and even supporting whole industries, like our outdoor dining program does for the restaurant industry. Others are crucial for public safety and livability, like our 823 Safe Traffic Safety and Livability Hotline, snow plowing during winter storms, bridge maintenance, and signal and street light inspections, and so much more. Our vision for Portland's transportation system is simple. One, it's that we would like to have a well-maintained street and sidewalk system that people can use to travel safely and efficiently, whether walking, biking, taking transit, or when driving personal and freight vehicles. We also want to make sure that our system allows for the efficient and safe movement of goods and offers opportunities for climate-friendly travel options as we move to our future. This vision also includes the identification and maintenance of ongoing sustainable funding so that we can consistently provide quality customer service and optimal asset management for a livable city. So a bit about our fiscal situation. Our ability to deliver the transportation system that Portland expects is already challenging with our current limited funding. If we look ahead 6 months, it's clear that PBOT is facing a full-on funding crisis. PBOT has a total transportation budget of about $510 million. However, the majority of those funds are restricted resources, which can only be used for very specific things. Our remaining budget is our General Transportation Resources, or GTR. This consists of state highway funds, 60%, and parking revenues, which come in at 40%. These are resources that we have to use to support basic maintenance and bureau operations. These funds have not been keeping up with the cost of doing the service and inflation. Our parking revenues in particular have decreased significantly since the beginning of the pandemic. State highway funds are also projected to continue to decline as people switch to more fuel-efficient vehicles, something which we want, but which is challenging for our budget. Even within our general transportation resources, we have some restricted resources that are dedicated to City of Portland debt obligations for the Selwood Bridge and the Milwaukee Max Light Rail, for example. This means that we really only have $99 million in truly discretionary resources. Again, these funds for the Bureau are for maintenance and operations, or in other words, it's how we keep our lights on. So for the 24-25 fiscal year, we are currently facing a $32 million shortfall, or about 1/3 of this general transportation revenue. Sorry. Here are additional details about our restricted resources. Among them are grant funds for specific capital projects, funds from the Bureau of Environmental Services for the maintenance and operations work our crews do on their behalf, and permit revenue that pays for permit-related services. Much of these resources are one-for-one in that revenue generated goes directly back into the program to fund staffing and operations. One thing that you won't see in PBOT's budget is significant general fund support or property taxes. Many people believe that the city's general fund, like in many cities around Oregon and the rest of the country, help to support PBOT, and that is simply not true. Only about 2% of our funding came from the general fund last year. So what does the future hold? PBOT's ability to deliver even the most basic transportation services is at risk. Our current budget shortfall comes after multiple budget cuts over the last several years. This slide highlights the reductions made to date to address our revenue shortfalls. Over the last 5 years, we have taken reductions totaling $20.5 million and 60 positions. We have also depleted all of our $63 million in reserves. We are keenly aware of the fact that the services we are providing today are currently not enough to meet the needs of Portlanders. Our staff feel the same frustration as the public on a regular basis about their inability to serve our city at full capacity due to significant budget cuts and reduced services. Knowing we're facing a $32 million shortfall, PBOT collected additional information from both City Council and the public to help inform our budget reduction strategy for fiscal years 24 and 25. The first thing we did was to take a closer look at City Council priorities, including in areas like livability. We then compared council priorities with PBOT's strategic plan, goals, and values. The good news is that PBOT's goals align very well with City Council priorities. We also did a public poll with DHM Research asking the public what the highest priority areas are for us to focus on in their opinion. This statistically representative public poll collected 600 responses. PBOT also sent out a survey of the poll through our own social media and email lists, and we asked our own employees. Across the board, we saw that the two top priority areas were maintenance and safety. So in combination with the City Council's priorities, there are 3 areas that rose to the top: maintenance, safety, and livability. We approached our budget reductions by first cutting all non-priority areas. However, the required level of cuts was simply too deep. Cutting only deprioritized work with outside of these categories, but did not add up to $32 million. As a result, we had to dig deeper and look at cuts in other areas of the Bureau as well. So this is a lot of detail and a lot of small numbers, and I probably will go through this slide much quicker than would allow you the opportunity to do a full review. There's a lot of detail, but I want to show you the slide because it contains our current draft proposal for reductions across the Bureau. The first column represents the PBOT group or the line of service. These are the groups that our work is currently organized into within the Bureau. The programs column provides a high-level description of the work done in each group, followed by their current budget, the percentage budget, and FTE cut. Some of these FTEs are currently vacant, but many are filled. The painful truth is that there is no way for us to take $32 million out of our $99 million in flexible general transportation revenues, cutting 1/3 of our budget without huge impacts. We will not be the same Bureau. Our current estimate is that 127 full-time equivalent positions will be impacted by these cuts. So what happens next? We are continuing to have conversations with stakeholders and City Council to try to mitigate the cuts and to determine what services we'll be able to ensure we are continuing. We will submit our official proposed budget to City Council in January. Throughout the spring, City Council goes through their normal budget process with several work sessions. Typically, the budget hearings where people can provide input are in June before the final budget is adopted. A quick note on fixing our streets. This is our local 10-cent gas tax, which has been passed by the voters twice, once in 2016 and again in 2020. We plan to send the measure to the voters again in May of 2024 for renewal. If it is not passed, it would mean the loss of another roughly $20 million in investments per year on top of the current $32 million shortfall. Beyond this budget cycle, we know there are still many challenges and opportunities ahead when it comes to the bigger picture of transportation funding for Portland. We still have work to do in educating the public about how transportation is funded in an unsustainable way. That is the first step in the process of reimagining our funding structure so that it is not in direct conflict with our multimodal and climate goals. Excuse me. Finally, we as a community need to come together to identify inflation-indexed, sustainable funding to support a vibrant, safe, sustainable, and well-maintained transportation system that will serve Portland well for the remainder of this century and beyond. I look forward to discussing with you this evening how we'll get there. Thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Director Williams. We'll now shift to transportation planning and policies at the metro level. As noted earlier, I'll be pinch hitting for Councilor Simpson, who sends his regrets about an unavoidable and unanticipated conflict. Metro is unique as the only elected regional government in the country. It has an eclectic set of responsibilities, including the zoo, performance and exhibition spaces, natural areas, and solid waste. Recently added responsibilities include stewarding voter pass funding for affordable housing construction and housing and homeless-related services. Metro's role in transportation planning is perhaps its most traditional function, as it serves as the federally required Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO, for the region, making a conduit for all federal transportation funds in the region. All large metropolitan areas have an MPO, although generally they're made up of appointed officials from local governments rather than being directly elected. MPOs ensure that coordinated transportation planning happens across multiple local jurisdictions. For example, when we're planning the Blue Line for Max, it wouldn't have made sense if Portland said, well, we want it on Burnside, and Gresham said, no, we want it on Division. We have to make decisions as a region. We can't just be a collection of local governments. As part of its MPO responsibilities, Metro adopts a Regional Transportation Plan, or RTP, every 5 years. Having an adopted RTP is a requirement for using federal dollars. The RTP describes regional policies, revenue sources, and a project list that can be accomplished within that expected revenue. This is called the constrained project list, as well as aspirational projects that do not currently fit within the available resources. Federal dollars cannot be spent on projects that are not on the project list. This is effectively a check and balance relating to priorities established by the Oregon legislature. So while the state may have one idea, Metro can invoke federal authority if it has different ideas, and that makes for interesting conversations. The MPO function has its own checks and balances with local governments. The RTP must be adopted by both the elected Metro Council and by JPACT, the Joint Policy Advisory Committee on Transportation, which is an advisory committee composed of local elected officials and agency officials, city councilors, county commissioners, the TriMet general manager, et cetera. The RTP is not considered adopted until both Metro Council and JPACT adopt the same version of the document. Metro also has an advisory committee on land use issues called MPAC, Metro Policy Advisory Committee, and it can make recommendations on the RTP, but does not have approval authority itself. Both JPACT and MPACT have corresponding technical advisory committees consisting of staff from those jurisdictions. I've had the honor of serving as a community representative both on MPAC and on the Transportation Technical Advisory Committee. The RTP is also a land use document under Oregon's land use planning system, and therefore must be acknowledged by the State Land Use and Development Commission. That commission also does the state rulemaking around greenhouse gas goals and that the RTP must meet, so that connection is important for climate. We're at the very end of the adoption process for the 2023 RTP. The 2018 RTP will expire on December 1st. JPACT is voting on the 2023 RTP tomorrow morning, so grab some popcorn and join us online at 7:30 a.m. Metro Council will hold a public hearing, its third on the RTP, and vote on the RTP on November 30th. So there's not any room to spare in the schedule. Development of the 2023 RTP began as soon as the 2018 RTP was complete, and Council and Metro have held multiple meetings and workshops over the last 5 years as the policy was developed. Metro has also funded community organizations like the Street Trust to do outreach on the plan. Development of the 2028 RTP begins next month. So thanks for understanding Councillor Simpson's conflict. I hope I outlined the important role that Metro plays in transportation planning. We now turn to transportation safety, and our next presenter is the Interim Executive Director of Oregon Walks, Zachary Lauritsen. A former educator, he views transportation advocacy much as he views education. Our work is to advocate for the most vulnerable and disempowered. In transportation, that means everyone, regardless of age, ability, or wealth, has access to move around their community safely. Zachary.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate you introducing me. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight and putting on an event like this with a conversation around transportation. I think about transportation as one of the few things that are truly universal in our community. You know, getting around, right? Transporting oneself is one of those things. We all experience the positives and the negatives of our transportation system. It depends on things like our ability, our wealth, our access to a vehicle, how and where we travel, that really highlight those positives and those negatives that we experience in our transportation system. Real briefly about Oregon Walks. We're a small nonprofit organization. We're based here in Portland. We do pedestrian advocacy, and we have kind of three pillars. One is we put on walks. So usually with partners, we'll put on some sort of a walk around an idea or a concept or a neighborhood or something like that. Second piece is around education and organizing people who care about pedestrian advocacy. And so tonight would be an example, right, around the education pillar. And then the third thing is we do advocacy in a few different kind of forms or realms. So sometimes we do project-specific advocacy. That might be sitting on a committee, or it might be testifying. And to kind of give you a names to put to that, it might be around the I-5 bridge replacement, or it might be around outer division infrastructure. It might be like the way I got started at Oregon Walks was organizing on 82nd Avenue. And then we do a small, I'd like to say meaningful, but a small kind of statewide advocacy part of our work with Oregon legislation or Oregon legislature. We have a saying at Oregon Walks that everyone's a pedestrian. For some, it's the only way they get around, right? Some people choose to walk everywhere. Some people are forced to walk everywhere for whatever reasons. And then kind of on the other extreme, there's walking from your house to your car, and then from the parking lot to wherever you're going. But regardless, we say everyone's a pedestrian, right, at some level, and that's really critical in the way we see the world. I also think about our transportation system being quite miraculous. We've got billions and billions. I haven't counted up the ledger, probably trillions in the state of Oregon of dollars invested in how we move in our system and how we move hundreds of thousands of people around just the Portland metro area every day. And especially if you have access to a personal automobile, you can drive just about anywhere pretty darn quick. I'm guessing most everyone here kind of has that understanding. But there is kind of a hidden and harmful underbelly to the transportation system we've developed. And I don't want to come across as like a real drag or a bummer, but I think it is worth just being honest with ourselves and kind of recognizing some of the unique challenges we face with how we've built a transportation system really in the last 80 or 90 years. And what I want to highlight of these things is that it's pretty unique in that a lot of the hidden and harms that come with a transportation system actually impact people who aren't using the transportation system. So the harms are often pushed off on people who are not actively using the transportation system. And I want to give a couple examples. One example is noise. So just at my home in Northeast Portland, there's about 55 to 60 decibels from I-84, constant noise. Our air particulate pollution, there's a bunch of research that shows that respiratory diseases like asthma are significantly higher in populations, especially kids who live near our big corridors. There's a bunch of new research in the last few years about just the particulate that comes off of tires that gets into our waterways and wreaks havoc on fisheries. Transportation counts for, and Jana, you may talk about this later, about a third of our greenhouse gas emissions statewide. It's a huge number, right? Just one sector. And then depending on how you add it up, the buckets can be a little different, but around 35 to 40% of our land in Portland is dedicated to cars in some way. And that's roads, driveways, gas stations, parking lots, those kind of things, right? And these are impervious surfaces that have a lot of challenges on the water runoff front, but especially if you've been around a big wide road in the summer, they contribute to heat island effects that are really significant. And then there's, and maybe this resonates most with kind of the parents and the pet owners in the room, but there's this very real kind of mental health impact on people, which is there's always a worry around harm. You know, what if your child runs out into the street or your pet runs out in the street, and the harm can be catastrophic, right? And that's grating. And I have a 2-year-old and I have a 4-year-old. It's always on my mind, right? And I'm guessing that resonates with some folks here tonight. And that last point about harm is very real. And I'm guessing everyone here, this is no surprise to them, that traffic injuries and fatalities are at an epidemic proportion in the state of Oregon. I'm going to give some numbers here just to give you an illustration. Just here in Portland, in 2018, 34 people were killed. 2019, 51 people were killed. In 2020, 59 people were killed. 2021, 73. 2022, 70. And this year, the year is not over, we're at 61 people have been killed on our streets. And it's not just people who've died. There are thousands more who have been seriously injured. And we here at Oregon Walks contend that it's because we have prioritized vehicle speed and convenience instead of building a transportation system that holds safety like right here as an unwavering priority. We know that people are dying on our streets, if people are being killed by vehicles. But we continue to have wide and fast streets that allow folks to move fast, too close to others. That jeopardizes lives in very real ways. And I recognize why. I'm not living in a cave here. I recognize why. America has a love affair with cars. There are billions of dollars in advertising each year to encourage people to buy bigger and faster cars. Our entertainment industry glorifies driving fast, often recklessly. Oregon Walks does not have a $1 billion budget to counter program that. But we believe that, and I guess I want to also say, we believe and understand that there's absolutely a role for private vehicles in our system. You know, I have a vehicle too, right? But that a truly forward-thinking transportation system, one, again, that prioritizes safety and climate, doesn't just say they prioritize safety and climate, but prioritizes safety and climate, would be over-investing in walking, biking, and transit. We are decades behind in the years of investing in car-specific driving infrastructure. We are years behind, decades behind, and now we need to catch up, and we need to over-invest into systems that prioritize humans walking, humans biking, and humans using transit. It's a critical conversation. It's going to take courage from our political leaders. I admire everyone who's here, who's given time to have this conversation tonight, and I look forward to it with everyone on the panel. So thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Zachary. Our next presenter is Jana Gastelum, who heads the Oregon Environmental Council. She has 2 decades of experience building coalitions and passing ambitious policies, including wins that cut climate pollution and advance transportation electrification, among other wins. We'll now hear the latest on these points. Take it away, Jana.
Thank you, Chris. And I also want to thank the League tonight. I really appreciate forums where you're really fostering civic engagement. And I want to thank all the other panelists tonight. I always really enjoy being a part of these conversations. And I really, really believe, right, we all have to be in these conversations. We need to be talking to our electeds. And I see I am frozen. Let me try this again. Let me see if I can come back here. So I'm really appreciative for the chance to have dialogue tonight, and I always learn from co-presenters. I am going to share my screen. I am Jana Gastelum. I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon Environmental Council. We are a statewide environmental nonprofit, and our kind of mission and vision is to champion equitable, innovative, and collaborative solutions to Oregon's environmental challenges for today and future generations. And we really do think that that long look is really important, because if we're only solving the problems that are right in front of us, we're missing some of these longer term trends that are really important to keep track of. We're very collaborative in spirit. We believe it's going to take everyone to move solutions forward, and we need to find common ground. It's really important to have strong vision, but we also need really inclusive decision making as we wrestle with these really large conversations in front of us. How do we have equitable access to the transportation services that we all need to live our full and robust lives and have access to opportunity? And how are we doing it in a way that doesn't wreck the climate along the way? One of our superpowers is really engaging in statewide conversations. We really get involved in our legislative work, but it's not just sort of passing bills and thinking of the ideas, but we follow them through to implementation. We stay at the table, we sweat the details, and we care that programs are implemented well, and also that they are funded along the way. It's great to pass great ideas, but if we don't have the resources, if we don't have the bodies to implement programs, then we're only doing part of the job. So I appreciate that this group of people seems to also care about those details and how things play out over time as well. I'm going to talk a little bit more about climate change and the impacts in the intersection with transportation. So thank you, Chris, for setting the stage so well. Transportation still is a major source of climate pollution in the state and is the sector that's sort of single most responsible for climate pollution. And this comes from basically burning oil and petroleum in cars and trucks. So we know that transportation itself is a major source of climate pollution. But climate impacts are really impacting our ability to move around, to get where we need to go, and the cost of doing that. So climate impacts are everything from sea level rise that's eroding and undermining roadways in coastal parts of our state. Some communities have, one road in and one road out. And so that infrastructure is really important to keep secure and safe. There's flooding and washouts. We're all familiar with wildfires. Unfortunately, they not only close down roads, but they also damage roadways. And then extreme heat can really impact our roadways as well, and also soften metal can slow down transit. We have seen many cases where we've even had stoppages, and extreme heat is dangerous for people, and we don't have enough cooling in our buildings. So people also need access to cooling centers. And if our main transit systems have to stop or slow down during extreme heat events, that's leaving people in harm's way as well. And then temperature volatility, of course, impacts all of that when you kind of yo-yo between extreme heat and freezing temperatures as well. So when we think about solutions to the climate crisis, we need to make sure that we are covering all the legs of this stool. We have to think about cleaner vehicles, we need to think about cleaner fuels, and we need to think about having a truly multimodal system. And so, Zachary, thank you so much for representing the pedestrian and walking and the safety side of this, because we can't have a complete system without that piece of it. I was asked to talk a little bit more about transportation electrification tonight. So that really means transforming how we power our transportation system. And it used to be that we only thought that there was one fuel type, and it had to go into, it was a liquid and it went into a gas tank, and you had to burn it, and you had to create air pollution and climate pollution along the way. Today's world is very different. We are breaking the oil monopoly and making sure that people have choices that are cleaner. And there are options across all vehicle types and ranges, from light duty vehicles like those, the car in your maybe front driveway, to trucks, delivery trucks, transit buses, school buses. I was a kid who grew up in some pretty remote places. I had an 1.5 hour long bus ride, breathing in a lot of diesel exhaust and getting carsick along the way. So it personally thrills me that we have cleaner vehicles to transport kids in today. But also micromobility, electric bikes and scooters and other things that actually open up additional options for clean ways for people to get around. We know about 1/3 of Oregonians don't drive because of age, income, and ability. And so it's really important that we have options that give everybody access to transportation services that they need. So transportation electrification is, of course, the vehicles themselves, but it's also how we charge them and fuel them. And this is what's sort of exciting about the idea of electrification and democracy, that you no longer have to rely on one large oil industry to think about fueling your vehicle, but people are able to fuel up at home. But we do need more infrastructure out there to help people charge. And we need more opportunities for people who live in multifamily dwellings, also workplaces and public spaces. And fortunately, charging infrastructure is really moving forward, that now there are these quick charging stations that are available that can get people in and out in quicker time. But I think people also like the idea of having more options, that if you could avoid having to go to a gas station and not have that time or have that exposure to those fumes, then that feels like a cleaner and time-saving option as well. But Oregon, as a state, is pouring relatively fewer dollars than our West Coast counterparts into both helping people access the vehicles of all types, as well as the charging infrastructure. So Oregon has an electric vehicle rebate, but it's only funded at about, $10 to $12 million a year. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is this boom bust cycle where people sign up, they get in line for it, and about 3 to 4 months into the year, we run out of dollars. This rebate is really important. It helps people bring down the cost, the upfront cost of vehicles. And the way Oregon designed our program was really great. It said, here's an upfront rebate for you. It's not about getting money back on your taxes, but it helps bring down the cost. And Oregon was one of the first states back in 2017 to also make sure that there was a program in place for low and moderate income households, and that a rebate could also be applied to used vehicles. And now we're delighted to see that in some of the federal programs, used vehicles are also available for incentives and rebates. But again, Oregon's program is relatively underfunded. We don't really have programs in place that help with trucks and heavy duty vehicles in a kind of consistent way. So we're harnessing programs here and there, like the Clean Fuels program in Oregon provides some grant funding, but we've never really stood up a state rebate for trucks and heavy duty vehicles as well. So we hope to see that coming. And then we really do need to build out that charging infrastructure in a really logical way and think about the places that are very, very underserved right now. I'm going to keep an eye on the clock and move us forward. I do want to make sure that people leave with some information. Go Electric Oregon is a site that helps connect people to more information, but also learn about incentives and rebates. In some cases, utilities are providing rebates, the state is, and the federal government as well. And there's just a lot of peer-to-peer learning and conversation to be had around electrification. I have a vehicle. I have traveled down I-5 down to California in it, and have stopped and charged along the way. Met a great kind of father-daughter crew that was out on their first EV road trip, but they had never been to a charging station before. And so just learning kind of the new language of how to interact with these things is really important to have community around. So there's still a lot of education and hands-on learning that would be great for more people to be able to do. I was also asked tonight to talk a little bit about, as we think about all the priorities, to have a clean, just multimodal system. As Millicent pointed at the beginning, our funding isn't keeping pace with the need and even just the basic needs. And so we are going to be having a pretty robust statewide conversation over the next couple of years about how do we fund our transportation needs throughout the state, what we fund it on, and really keeping a really close eye on the size and scale of projects. We have a lot of debt that we're still paying back for big projects that we've committed to in the past. And going forward, we really need to be thinking about how we make the best use of our transportation dollars. Some transportation dollars are limited and restricted in what they can go to. That's the Highway Trust Fund, and it can only be spent on things that are kind of in roadways. It doesn't fund things like transit operations. It doesn't fund things like electric vehicle rebates. And so we really have a mix of systems and opportunities. What we want to make sure happens is that in every decision that the state makes about either how we're going to fund something and what we're going to fund, that we have a really strong policy overlay, that we're making sure that the funding mechanisms line up with our values, that they're done in a way that promote climate smart, equitable, and safe mobility, and that we're not having funding mechanisms that write blank checks and don't have accountability mechanisms associated with them. We want to make sure that community needs are met. And oftentimes, right, the biggest voices, the loudest voices, the most organized voices are the ones that can pay and afford to be in the building. And we need to make sure that community voices are actually heard and the underrepresented voices and those needs are very much centered in these conversations as well. I'm not going to walk through each of these funding mechanisms that would put everyone to sleep this late at night. But I did go on to give a little bit of a sense of flavor about what these are. I'm happy to answer questions. And just note that some of them really can be used to help us use our transportation system in a more efficient way. But we also need to be really investing in the things that help people where they're at. We need robust bike, pedestrian, walking, and safe infrastructure. We need to be shifting people to more shared transportation modes like transit. And we need to make sure that we're doing it all in a fair and equitable way. And there's some exciting opportunities ahead of us to reshape and reimagine the system so that it delivers better outcomes from the beginning. So I will pause there and shift this back over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Jana. We'll now turn to the Q&A, and to give the audience time to put questions in the chat, I have some initial questions for each panelist. But given this great group, do you have thoughts on each other's comments that you'd like to interject at this moment? No, you're all being too polite? Okay. Well, we'll start with a question for Director Williams.
I'd like to say something, Chris.
Sure.
I really liked what Zachary said about frankly, the access that walking and pedestrianism provides. And, certainly people experience that mode in different ways and to different degrees. But as we look at the overall system, one of the things that we're encouraging our team to do all the time is make sure that we're looking at how we can make sure that true multimodal transport is actually something that can happen, and that isn't so far out of reach that people don't see looking at an option as an option. So I just wanted to acknowledge the comments that you made, Zachary, about the benefits of having a strong pedestrian network and the access walking and cycling and driving provide, but really as we look at some of the ways that transportation infrastructure really can either help or potentially challenge communities, certainly being able to move about with relative ease, whether that's on sidewalks or using ADA ramps or any of the other ways that pedestrians move about. It just reminds me of how critically important it is to make sure that we aren't failing to think about that mode that's at the top of our our modal hierarchy.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments from the panelists? All right, well, Director Williams, you get the first question. You briefly mentioned fixing our streets, the local gas tax. Can you talk a little bit more about the history of fixing our streets, how those funds will be invested if it's renewed? And I'll add on something I see in the chat, which is there's a heavy vehicle fee that sort of corresponds to the gas tax part of fixing our streets. If you want to comment about how that factors in, that would be great as well.
Sure. So thanks for your question. So fixing our streets, I kind of mentioned it in our earlier talking points, is our local 10-cent gas tax. It's the local 10-cent gas tax with, and it's coupled with the heavy vehicle use tax. So we originally passed Fixing Our Streets in 2016, and it was renewed in 2020. It will be up again for renewal in 2024. Funds that are realized through that source are used to repave streets and fix potholes, to improve streetlights, and to make it easier for the youngest Portlanders to walk, bike, and roll to school, among other things. So Fixing Our Streets has allowed us to deliver dozens of critical projects in 3 overarching areas. We have multiple projects that we consider for smoother streets, the smoother street projects. We have paving projects that allow us to make the most cost-effective investment in both busy streets and neighborhood streets. And we're also investing in safer streets, which includes pedestrian crossings and lighting improvements on high crash corridors, as well as investments in safe routes to schools. At one point, we tried to split our projects between maintenance and safety, but the reality is that almost all of our projects are both, especially when we look at the Fixing Our Streets list of projects. We also provide basic street services through Fixing Our Streets, which includes filling potholes and implementing traffic calming projects. We've had great success with Fixing Our Streets in its second renewal, and as we prepare to go back to the voters, we're planning to keep our investment in these general areas. We're making some small adjustments based on what we've learned over the years about implementation, but we expect to deliver a very similar program in the third round of Fixing Our Streets. In 2020, we received 77% support for Fixing Our Streets at the ballot. While we know that we're in a different environment now than we were in 2020, we hope that we'll have Portlanders' support again so we can continue to make these important investments. If Fixing Our Streets doesn't pass, and I mentioned this before, this could mean another significant drop of services in addition to the budget reductions that I just discussed. And Chris, I didn't quite hear your question on the heavy vehicle use tax. I need to turn something up.
Yeah, I think someone in the audience just wanted to understand how that fit in with the gas tax portion of Fixing Our Streets. How do they relate to each other?
Sure. So the heavy vehicle use tax is literally what it says. It's a tax that motor carriers and other large vehicles that are using the roadway pay into. It's not the 10-cent gas tax. It is a different categorization of tax that not just small trucks, but larger trucks that are using the interstates are paying. And so that does contribute to the overall makeup of our discretionary budget, but the heavy vehicle use tax is a separate category than the one that is considered for motor vehicles based on the way that they fuel their vehicles and power the vehicles.
And am I correct in thinking that the heavy vehicle tax is enacted by council rather than part of the voter approved?
That is correct. It is a separate funding mechanism, a shared mechanism, but a separate mechanism, a companion mechanism, excuse me, but a separate mechanism.
Great, thank you. So this is the awkward moment where I get to ask myself a question, standing in for Councilor Simpson. And the proposed question is, what's the hot topic in the RTP, the Regional Transportation Plan, this time around? And it goes by a number of names. ODOT calls it tolling. Other folks might call it congestion pricing. But it's the idea that we're going to have some charge in addition to a fuel tax for using heavy corridors in the metro region, specific to the region. And what ODOT is proposing is tolling, first on a section of I-205, and then a little bit later on pretty much all of I-205 and I-5 between the Columbia River and Wilsonville. There is pricing policy in the Regional Transportation Plan. It was first added to the 2018 RTP as kind of we really need to think about pricing. But the 2023 RTP, that's flushed out, and there's a whole section on what the plan calls congestion pricing. And the difference between congestion pricing and tolling is sort of your intent and what you're going to use the money for. In the RTP, it would suggest that we're using congestion pricing to manage demand on the heavy facilities, including the freeways, while using those revenues for things that improve the equity of the transportation system. So funding things like transit, biking and walking, as Zachary has talked about. But ODOT's plan is to use tolling to help them pay for their major projects, which include about $500 million they're already under construction with at the Abernathy Bridge in Oregon City, and then the Rose Quarter project, which now has a price tag of $1.4 to $1.9 billion. So that's a big debate. And I mentioned that we have different advisory committees at Metro that weigh in on this. MPAC, the Land Use Committee, which is advisory, and JPAC, which has the actual approval authority, along with the Metro Council. MPAC has proposed an amendment to the plan to slow down the adoption of that tolling, to put the actual implementation of the toll gantries and the back office systems into the unconstrained list on the RTP, so a little further out time-wise. Predictably, ODOT is not happy about that. ODOT does have a seat on JPAC, so they'll very much be in the discussion. And as I mentioned, we'll hear that play out tomorrow morning at 7:30. And I think that I think that meeting tomorrow will be the decision point, because the odds of the Metro Council not adopting exactly what JPAC does and causing the regional transportation plan to expire and stop the flow of federal funds are pretty low. So I think tomorrow is the big decision day on that, and we'll have a pretty robust discussion about what the future of roadway pricing is in the region. Okay, and now I'm going to turn to Jana. Since there are separate legislative committees on environment, health, and transportation, are there particular challenges to connecting transportation issues to climate and public health policy in Salem?
That is a great question. I do think siloing is challenging. And this is where, I mean, if I kind of go back to that initial slide about who we work with and how many voices need to be in the conversation, I do think that there have been some really remarkable campaigns and education and messaging opportunities. We have seen different people come in wearing different hats to talk about the public health impacts, both from the dangers and harms of transportation and also the benefits of active transportation. I think one of the harder challenges, Chris, sometimes though, is just that, there's constant turnover in the legislature and in our decision makers. And so there's always a need and effort to sort of have groups continue to stay in the arena and educate and re-educate and reach out. 50% or more of our legislators have come on since 2020. And there's a lot of turnover in leadership just within the legislature, right? With brand new governor, although she knows the legislature and has worked her way around state government a bit. So that's good and that's fortunate. But even within the legislature, the House leader and the Senate president are also kind of newer in those roles. So I think it's the constant need for people to keep showing up, to tell their stories and to stay civically engaged. And for people to really actually use those times when legislators have town halls and coffees to show up and talk about these issues and why they matter from those points that are lived, right? Because as Zachary said, right, it is noisy to live near roadways. My kids went to a preschool that was just right off of 84, and I know exactly the particulate matter that they were inhaling in their still developing little lungs. So it's important that we connect these issues to all those other areas that people care about. But yeah, I think it's a great point to think about the siloing and how to break that down.
Thank you. And I'll plug an opportunity to tell our stories. The Joint Transportation Subcommittee for Transportation Planning, which has been kind of given the hot potato of the tolling question in the legislature, is having a series of meetings in the region later in the month. They'll be having a session in Rose Quarter on November 29th, and tolling meetings in Oregon City and East Portland on December 2nd. The locations for those haven't been announced yet, but those are going to be key opportunities for folks in the region to have their voices heard. Okay, we'll go back to Zachary. And the question to you, Zachary, is would you talk about the relationship between transportation and land use planning, jobs, and housing? Just a small topic.
Just give me 30 seconds and we'll nail it. It'll be done. So one of the things that quickly dawns on you as you start doing transportation advocacy is how closely related where people need to go and how they get there, how closely related those things are. And since World War II, we built our cities in ever expanding concentric circles out. And we know that housing prices generally are more expensive further out. And so as people are searching housing that they can afford, they are often forced. They don't have an option. Literally, they don't have an option, right? And I think Director Williams, you kind of alluded to this, like an option that's viable for them to get around. Let's say your kid is at a school that's a mile and a half away and the grocery store is 2 miles away, or you want to have a chat with a friend at a cafe and it's, 3/4 of a mile away, and your work happens to be, you live on 132nd and Gleason and your work's in Hillsborough, right? You just don't have options, right? So you start to very quickly realize that the nexus between transportation, workforce, jobs, housing is really tightly knit. And actually, it's one of the reasons I have some hope and excitement about the next Portland city government is that I think there's an opportunity to break people out some of their silos. Those are all bureaus, right, that deal with those different things, and to break people out of those silos and having our civil servants kind of work together a little closer. I think that's a hope. It may not happen. So that's one kind of thought. And so, Director Williams, she has her hands full, right? Like you've got people who have, for lack of choices, they can't afford housing close to their work, and so therefore they're driving far and fast because we've created a transportation system that's designed for people. I mean, go out to East Portland, right? Long, straight, wide roads, extremely dangerous. And so people can get long, far distances around. And so we have to have a really serious conversation about how we build our cities. But now it's a conversation about how do we retrofit our cities so that people can get to their daily needs without having to get in the car for everything, right? And so that's going to take money. That's going to take political capital. That's going to take visioning. But until we just change that people can get out of their car and instead walk, take transit, or take a bike to the things that they need every single day, we will continue to have massive amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. We'll continue to have massive carnage, lives lost on our streets. So that's the primer. But the big kind of takeaway is we have to create cities that allow people to get around to their daily needs without just getting into their vehicle and going.
Thanks, Zachary. Jana, we've got a bundle of EV-related questions here that I'm going to drop in your lap. The first is, what's the prospect for the legislature fully funding the EV rebate program so it doesn't expire a few months into every session or year? The second part of that is, I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. What's the relationship between having charging capacity at home versus having chargers out in the public sphere? You touched on that a little bit, but maybe if you could dive into that relationship. And then a topic that I know you're deeply invested in is, what do we do given that electric vehicles will not pay gas taxes?
Yes. Okay. I might have you prompt me, take those one by one again. Okay. So funding for the EV rebate program. We fortunately did get a better revenue forecast, another good revenue forecast. So it is always hard when there's more of a scarcity mindset going into the legislature. That being said, there are some big priorities on the table, and we're going into a short session. It's a 5-week session. So things have to be pretty well baked going in. And a lot of the funding priorities are similar to what they were last session. I think we have a good shot at getting some additional support and resources, especially for the charge ahead component of the electric vehicle rebate program for Oregon. But I think it will be a battle to get full funding so that the program to the level that it needs to be at. And so I think this will be an ongoing conversation for the 2025 transportation package. Okay, what was the second question, Chris?
The second one was the relationship between charging at home and charging on the road, and what the needs and how we fund those two things fit together.
Yeah. Well, and this is interesting. So as vehicle technology improves and there's longer range, then the at-home charging, I think, is really beneficial, and there's less and less range anxiety that's out there. The tricky thing is that not everyone has the same access at home to charging. So whether or not you have a driveway, whether or not you have a garage, whether or not you own your home, whether or not you're in multifamily housing. And so I do appreciate, I think the city of Portland is being creative about sort of how do you get more right-of-way charging. There are initiatives and proposals thinking about, lamp posts and other things that could help have infrastructure that's already there, that's electrified, and then make it more available and accessible for electric vehicle charging. But the reality is that not everyone has the same at-home access. So it does make it really important that we do have public charging stations as well. And it's also really important for travelers from out of town to have access to public charging. And in those places, there's a mix of, if you can kind of sit and charge at the grocery store a little bit longer time versus the quick charge where you're passing through and you really need to be in and out in 20 to 30 minutes. So we're going to need a range of charging types to really make it a robust ecosystem. And then finally, about declining gas tax revenue. So first of all, gas tax rate is a problem in and of itself, just because it's not indexed to inflation. With or without electric vehicles, it's not keeping pace with need, and it's certainly not keeping pace with inflation. And so that's why we have always had a range and a mix, right? There's been the fuel tax, but there has also been registration fees, and there have been other ways to collect resources. Ultimately, we do need to pay for the roads and how we use them. I think there are smarter things, like you mentioned earlier, Chris, too, like congestion pricing, that both collects revenue, but also smooths when people use the roadways. So we don't have to overbuild the number of lanes, but actually make better use of the roadways that we have. And we'd like to see then that virtuous cycle of reinvesting those dollars back into things that make a multimodal system. No matter what, we're going to need to keep having transportation funding conversations. And the way we've been doing it are these fits and starts every 10 or so years where we have a big political battle just around the gas tax. So I'd love to see a more rational system going forward that has that policy overlay for the things that we care about.
And I know that OAC has been a leader in the road user fee discussion, and maybe you could educate our listeners a little bit about what that's all about.
Yeah, the road user fee is actually used in Oregon somewhat already for heavy duty vehicles, the weight mile tax, which recognizes, right, heavier vehicles have more wear and tear on our roadways, so they should pay for that wear and tear and maintenance. And then the mile fee piece of it is, the more distance you travel, the more you're using those roads. So we already have kind of a working version of that. And it makes sense to think about applying that to other vehicle types as well. So the road user charge acknowledges, the more you drive, the more that you're using a service and a good, and the more you can contribute to it. And by the same token, the less that you drive, the more savings that you get. And there's a real benefit to that. And that, again, is sort of a positive reinforcement, so that we're reducing wear and tear where we can. We're reducing traffic pollution and climate pollution. And again, having the way we fund our system also reinforce the behavior that can be beneficial. We do, however, think it needs to be designed well. We would like to see it be progressive, not regressive. So let's keep in mind income and ability to have access to other options. And then we would love to see it reinforce vehicle efficiency. So let's make sure that there are discounts or positive reinforcement for efficient vehicles, and not a perverse incentive where you're more heavily increasing the charges for electric vehicles and then letting gas guzzlers off the hook.
Great, thank you. Director Williams, I think I'm going to throw this one to you first, and it's framed as perhaps finding a way to get funding for transit, how are delivery vehicles contributing to their fair share for the use of roads? As a cyclist, it feels that Amazon delivery trucks are always parking in bike lanes instead of finding and paying for parking spots, which also makes it less safe to bike. Are companies that rely on deliveries and residents who rely on mail ordering contributing to the upkeep of the transportation system? And I'm going to paraphrase that in terms of a national policy discussion that started is, should we be pricing access to the curb? And is that a potential future revenue source for PBOT or other jurisdictions?
So to quickly answer your question, yes, we should be charging. Currently, that is an area that we're looking very closely at because right now those smaller delivery trucks and vehicles that are parking at curbside, often in illegal spaces, are not paying to park for those few minutes that they're using the space. So we're wanting to make sure that as people are using the right of way, especially to engage in trade and commerce, that they are making the investment to keep their business going. That is a cost of doing business. And so there should be a contribution to the overall system to ensure that that opportunity. In the past, you have seen, if you, depending on where you live or where you work or travel or recreate, you'll see 5-minute, 10-minute zones for certain types of vehicles drop off, especially this is something that picked up during the pandemic. And while we want to make sure that people are able to get their goods and services and deliveries with relative ease, we do also need to make sure that as we are making that right of way available, as we're making roadway available, as we're making accommodation, that folks are contributing as well. So today, there are certain entities that are paying, and there are many that do, depending on how long they'll be at a curbside location, will make a small investment. That is not something that is uniform, but we are working toward making sure that's something that we're able to add to our list of options to help us to generate revenue.
Great, thank you. And I want to add in some information that's been passed on to me in the chat about those meetings of the legislature's Transportation Planning Subcommittee. Those are going to be first on Wednesday, November 29th, 5 to 7 p.m. is the meeting on Rose Quarter. We don't have locations on any of these, unfortunately, but it will be 5 to 7 p.m. On December 2nd, 10 a.m. to noon, will be a location in Oregon City, Westland, Gladstone to talk about tolling. And then 4 to 6 p.m. on the 2nd will be in an East Portland location. And there will also be one on December 13th, again, location TBD in the Wilsonville, Charbonneau, Lake Oswego area. So pencil those into your calendars and watch OLIS, which is the legislature's information system, for details on the locations. All right, let me go back to our list of questions. And if Zachary doesn't mind, I'm going to let him take a first pass at this, but then if there are other panelists who want to weigh in, I suggest raising the registration fee within Portland vehicle transportation maintenance boundary with a sliding scale based on miles traveled, vehicle weight, and engine efficiency. Those who pollute less, emit fewer GHG, and have less impact should pay less. What do you think of such a proposal? And Zachary, I'm going to toss this to you because I know that vehicle size also has a huge impact on safety. And I'll add in some context, which is that while at least counties and metro can charge a local registration fee, I'm not sure that cities can, and maybe Millicent knows the answer to that. But I do know that the current legislative authority does not allow scaling based on the factors that are proposed. It's basically a flat fee for vehicle type. But Zachary, if you want to talk about the policy idea and the impact on safety, go for it. And anyone else who wants to jump in, let me know after Zachary finishes.
For sure. Jean, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. You are really putting your finger on where we align as an organization. We know that, as Chris mentioned, that vehicles with higher front ends and vehicles that weigh more have significantly higher likelihood of causing serious injuries or death. And so what is the thing that is most likely to be captured by those two things is weight, is vehicle weight. So we believe that if you are going, so one of the proposals that's on the table for the next legislative session is to put a higher registration fee on EVs because they aren't paying gas taxes, right? And what our counter is no. You're disincentivizing good behavior for the climate. What you should be doing is putting a weight-based registration fee. And so if that is, so bigger the car, heavier the car, the more you pay a registration, right? Because of all the negative externalities that come along with a bigger and heavier vehicle. And then you can tag that to a second piece, which is if you are going to do a by mile charge, the road user charge, so every mile you drive that you pay a certain fee, that should be multiplied by the weight of the vehicle, because again, we're all trying to capture those different pieces of a larger vehicle and the harms that they cause. So that's where we stand. I think you put your finger on it, and it kind of, for me, it passes the like, yeah, that makes sense, common sense test, but it also passes the like, what are we trying to incentivize in our society test?
Great. Would any of the other panelists like to weigh in on that particular issue?
I think just making sure again that the overlay, that it is overall progressive and making sure to attend to any equity implications, but certainly traffic fatality and harm is one of those externalities that needs to be factored in. But that's exactly, I mean, I would agree. Those are the factors that need to be thought about.
Great. So the next question is funding related as well. And we talked about several new funding mechanisms, which was tolling, congestion pricing. We've talked about maybe pricing the curb. Are there other funding mechanisms that we might bring into play, since gas taxes we know are going down by both technology and inflation? Talked about the road user fee. Director Williams, are there other possibilities that Portland is looking at? I know I was on a task force, it was probably a decade ago, that talked about a utility fee as a way to fund transportation. Any other thoughts on how we might fairly get people to pay for transportation?
So you raised one already, and that is the user fee or household fee. That's something that we've very recently been considering. That would be for the price of a cup of coffee. Everyone contribute, and we would be able to make some of the improvements, or at least attend to the maintenance that's necessary throughout the whole city, not just parts of the city, not just the part of the city that gets to 82nd Avenue, but to the whole city limits all the way around. So that is one of the things that we're looking at. The utility licensing fee, which is something that is already established as a funding source for utilities. The unfortunate thing is that the Transportation Bureau does not receive any of that funding right now. The allocation has been adjusted, and those funds go to other entities right now. But if we were able to be beneficiaries of that funding source, some of the things that we have as challenges: the $32 million budget shortfall, the $4 billion maintenance backlog. While it wouldn't wipe it out, it certainly would provide for us the stability to be able to address in a systematic way how to solve some of the problems. Other things that we're hoping folks will consider is, instead of having a gas tax, looking more at a VMT model. We recognize that we couldn't do away with the gas tax today, but acknowledge that if we're doing our jobs well, the gas tax will be something that we wouldn't be able to depend on anyway to fund the way that we do our work. So that's another opportunity that we're looking at. And then there are some other creative ways that we seek to fund the work. In the presentation that I shared, you saw that our overall budget is $500 million. $100 million of that is discretionary. $400 million of that is restricted. half of that, so 200 million of that is actually grant funds. And so we're pretty aggressive in going after alternative funding sources that come from our federal and state and county or nonprofit partners in the industry that can help to support the work. So our capital project budget is like $225 million. Many of those projects have very little to zero general fund as a part of their makeup. And that's how we will be able to continue to keep the work going. That said, with grants, many of those require some type of match. And so identifying what the match would be is not something that we would be able to go to another grant funding source to allocate for, but rather that general transportation resource. So the leveraging points that we have are significant. They're tremendous. We just have to be able to say that we have a foundation upon which to build, and recognizing that the things that we currently depend on, that parking and gas, not something that we are able to do, and that we will be able to do in the future. So hopefully there will be the opportunity for council to come forward with some innovative ideas as well. We've shared with them a series of considerations that they will take those into consideration. But aside from simply reallocating general fund, looking at a user fee, looking at a street fee, making sure that the utility licensing fee does go towards transportation are some of the very top line things that we're talking about and considering. Left up to me, and this is why I'm not running for office, I would say sales tax, but that's how many jurisdictions pay for their infrastructure. It's sales tax. We don't have that. It's a benefit, but also creates a bit of a burden because there is not a pool of resources that's available. That's a consistent funding source that we can depend on. So that's again, that's a separate irrelevant conversation point, but that is something for folks to consider. When you feel like your taxes are paying for infrastructure, recognize that very little of your investment in property tax especially is paying for
I think we lost your audio there a little bit, but thank you for.
Can you hear me okay now? I'm sorry.
Yes,
I guess I faded out.
Thank you.
I don't know that I need to repeat it. I kind of just said the same thing again.
Yeah, thank you for that comprehensive answer. We have a series of safety related questions here, and I'm going to take the first one, which is there was a collision between a streetcar and a MAX train this morning over the Lloyd district. And the question is, how do we keep that from happening? I've been on the board of Portland Streetcar for 20 years, so I have a little bit of history on this. In some places, like the Tillicum Bridge, we actually have system interlocks that prevent multiple vehicles from being in the same place at the same time. In other places, like the Lloyd district, we rely on what are essentially traffic lights for those vehicles, although they're not the same traffic lights the drivers look at, but they do have signal lights. I suspect the question of what happened there is going to come down to either those lights didn't work or somebody didn't pay attention, but maybe that will prompt a discussion of whether we should have system interlocks in other places that we should invest in. I'm going to throw the next part of the safety question to Zachary, and that is about the push to change our language from talking about accidents to talking about crashes or collisions. Why are we advocating for that? And how do we relate with public safety bureaus like the Portland Police Bureau around that topic?
That's a great question, Debbie. Thank you for asking it. I think I'm going to try and keep it as narrow as possible on this answer because I think it's pretty straightforward. There are no accidents because what we build and the choices people make is what results in the deaths and the injuries and the crashes on our streets. And so I'll give you an example. When we build streets that are super wide and straight, we know people are going to be going fast. We know that that's going to result in crashes, right? That's not an accident. That was a choice. It was an intentional choice made by designers and engineers. When someone has been drinking and they make the choice to get into a vehicle, that's not an accident. They made a choice, or they had the ability, right? They had the ability to do that. The list goes on and on and on and on, right? The thing that I think that I am most moved by is that we have to show courage and bravery in our leadership to change the way that we build our streets so that we're not relying on people not to do things the wrong way, right? We have to do more than just have paint on the ground that protects a cyclist. We have to do more than just flex posts in the ground that protects a pedestrian, or some, crosswalk on the ground. And those are things, those are helpful, of course. But again, the choices we make are what result in the systems that we have and the people that are being killed. And so that's why it's not an accident. It is a crash.
And what's our conversation with public safety agencies about the language they use?
Yeah, I don't have a really good grasp on that right now, to be just totally to be frank. Jana, Chris, Dr. Williams, if any of you have some ideas, happy to hear.
I think based on my interaction with public safety, police, fire, as we talk about what's happening in the right-of-way and on roadways, is the traditional way to talk about those interactions, crashes, accidents, leads people to use the terminology that suggests that people were careless, so an accident. So there's the need for the education around not just the term of art, but the term of implication and what's implied by saying crash versus accident. But that requires not just a conversation, but culture shift around what happens in the right of way and how people are responding, even the way that they're talking about it. There isn't, what I've seen, a wholesale refusal to adjust. But I do think there is an opportunity for those of us who are using the language of the time and the language that more accurately reflects what's going on to come forward to help those who are talking about it and experiencing it in the ways that they are, understand why we might recommend that we use different terminology. So I don't think that there's a refusal as much as there's just a customary way of approaching that, the conversation and the work. But I can say that public safety, both fire and police and others, are working very closely with the transportation agency to make sure that we are in lockstep as it relates to how we are responding and some of the ways that we're creating opportunities for infrastructure to that communities have to ensure that they're safe.
Thank you for that. And the words that are chosen in the police report are also the words that tend to get picked up in the press reports. So it matters a lot what the word choice is there. I think we have time for one more question, and we have one that's sort of related to the public health aspects of transportation. And this is in the context of a project in North Portland that we're not going to have time to ask about, but the comment is, I'll point out that the residential areas affected are among the lowest income and most diverse in the city. If transportation agencies are serious about equity and taking care of those who have the least, as we've discussed, air pollution on the North Peninsula is the worst in the city, and we're also across from the CEI, the critical energy hub, which could become an inferno after the earthquake, spewing out toxic emissions. So, generalizing that, where does the equity of public health issues fit into the transportation conversation? And Jana, I'll ask you to take a first crack at that if you're willing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they have to be right at the heart and the center, right? Like ultimately, we need to be having a conversation about what Oregonians need and want, right? Not just particular stakeholder groups that have an outsized voice in the conversation. So yeah, and ultimately, right, like think about a place that feels good to walk in. That's about livability and thriving. Think about what a relief it is to breathe clean air, right? And every member of our community deserves that. This is really about gain and not loss. These changes that Zachary, you're right. Sometimes it takes courage and bravery, but really, like, this is about a better Oregon and better places to live and thrive in. And so I think we need to make sure to talk about this in an abundance framework where we can too, while knowing that there is severe disproportionate impact today that has to be corrected for.
Okay, thank you. That's a great note to end on, because at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Carolyn to wrap us up.
Yeah, well, thank you, Millicent, Jana, and Zachary, and especially Chris for taking care of 2 jobs tonight. We recognize that one panel can't address every transportation issue, but we hope that you find tonight's program a valuable beginning in understanding the transportation sector in Portland and surrounding areas. Thanks to Metro East Community Media for recording this program. The video and podcast will be available on the LWV PDX website in a few days. The League of Women Voters is a membership organization. We thank our members for their generous volunteer and financial support for these programs, and we welcome you to join the League. The program was also supported by our Education Fund and by the Carol and Velma Sailing Foundation. You'll find membership and donor information on our website. Thank you and good night.